Joining us on this rainy beginning of fall evening. Before we get started, I want to go ahead and acknowledge that we gather as guests on the unceded traditional lands of the Duwamish people who have lived in and been caretakers of the land here since time immemorial. We thank the people of the Coast Salish tribes for their stewardship, and we strive to nurture our relationships with Indigenous peoples of the Northwest by joining their efforts to work for social justice and to care for this land. I have a tiny bit of housekeeping to take care of before we launch in, namely 2 events coming up next week that you might be interested in if you are here tonight. First of all, on Thursday, September 21st, science journalist Lauren Grush and UW Aeronautics and Astronautics Department Chair Christy Morganson will be talking about Lauren's book, The Six, which tells the story of America's first women astronauts and is wicked cool if you like space at all. So you should come to that. And then on Friday, September 22nd, urbanist M. Nolan Gray will join us to talk about how current zoning policies have damaged American cities and how we can fix them. You can find that information and more on our website at www.ubookstore.com/events. Without further ado, it is my honor to introduce our speakers this evening. Claudia Rowe, currently a member of the Seattle Times editorial board, has covered public schools, child welfare, and juvenile justice for more than 3 decades. She is also an author. Her true crime memoir, The Spider and the Fly, won the Washington State Book Award in 2018, and her next book, State Raised, examines the connection between foster care and the criminal justice system. Kara Fitzpatrick is an editor at Chalkbeat. She won the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting in 2016 for a series about school segregation. She was a New Arizona Fellow in 2019 at New America and a Spencer Fellow at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism in 2018. Fitzpatrick lives in New York City with her husband and children, and she is the author of The Death of Public School, the book we are discussing this evening. And without further ado, it's my honor to turn it over to our speakers.
Well, we should first let you know that this is actually Kara's publication day. So this is technically her book launch. Here we are. So I will just plunge in and do a little sort of backstory. I wanted to acknowledge to you guys and to Kara that a book like this is a huge lift, right? It's a massive amount of research, it's a historical deep dive. So I wanted to ask Kara first, what about the topic of school choice, vouchers, charters, and that entire arena attracted you as an idea to which you wanted to devote years of your life?
Yeah, I didn't plan on it being years of my life as it turned out. But when she said you were working on a second book, I was like, I don't know. I don't know if I want to do that again. But I had some advice early on from someone who said if you're going to write a book, it should be something that's still going to interest you at 2 a.m, 3 years from now, when you think you really made a bad decision in your life, to write one. And that I think actually was great advice, because I still found it fascinating years in, and was learning new things, and so it's just such a compelling topic. And at the time that I started, it wasn't as huge politically. So I had a few people say, well, isn't that kind of over? Like, why don't you write a book about this? And then now it's coming out of this moment where it's everywhere, and it's a huge part of the conversation. So that's been kind of fun.
What initially inspired your interest? What was it, that Pulitzer Prize winning project about segregation, or was it something else?
It was a little bit of that. When we were doing that project, there was a team of reporters at the Tampa Bay Times in Florida. And one of the things that we did, the project was not about school choice, it was about school segregation. But one of the things we did was we interviewed and followed about 100 families who were trying to, in some cases, escape these low-performing, under-resourced, segregated public schools. And so we watched them go to different choices, charter schools, maybe private school with a voucher. And in some cases, maybe they found something better. In some cases, they didn't, and they bounced, to other choices. And it just got me thinking about, well, what are your options, essentially, if you're somewhere that's not working for your child or the school's having problems. And that stuck with me, and did this fellowship at Columbia and took this idea I brought about segregation. And instead I ended up thinking, well, I'll write about where all of this is coming from.
Here we are. And I've read that you said, despite your intense immersion, that you didn't want to take hard and fast position for or against the school choice. However, the title of the book, The Death of Public School, kind of suggests a position. And can you talk a little bit about your title and where you've landed?
See, I think it's a subtle title. I don't know why people are having such a strong reaction to it, but no, I mean, I was coming in as a journalist, and so I wanted to write something that was, fair and accurate, and maybe would be interesting to people of different political beliefs and explain this moment. But I also felt like you've got a 60, 70-year movement for school choice, and you have at least 30 years of research on some of these programs that exist. And so you should, as a journalist, also be able to form some conclusions, right? And I don't think it's a yes or no, and I feel like people have written yes or no books. But it does, in this moment, point in a direction that doesn't seem super friendly to public education. So I felt like, it raises this question of, is this going to mean the death of public school? And then with the subtitle, a lot of people are upset about the subtitle being in the past tense, conservatives have won, as opposed to maybe they're winning, but we can turn the tide or something. But I was looking at how far they've already pushed things from where we started with no school choice at all, to where now today you can really talk about blue and red states having, almost different educational landscapes and options that are quite different if you live in Florida versus if you live in Washington.
One of the, I think, really interesting and really valuable aspects of the book is this very granular look at the early years around school choice. The history part at the front of the book is really fascinating, and you make a really convincing case that the sort of earliest seeds of the school choice movement in the 20th century were really planted by segregationists, and that the motivation was racism, straight up, like no subtlety really there. However, in more recent years, I think a lot of advocates have positioned or framed that discussion as one of trying to improve public education through competition. If we have these other examples, maybe that can inform what goes on in traditional public schools. So I'd be really interested in hearing what you think is powering the groundswell now.
So many places that you went with that. I think it's one of the threads that I was really interested in with the history was looking at how it's been used by different groups with very different motivations. And so in 1950, leading up to Brown versus Board of Education, it was being used by segregationists who were trying to avoid desegregating, public schools. And then in the 1990s, it shifted very much to this argument for, well, it's going to improve public education through competition, and also it's a tool for low-income children, especially children of color in urban cities. And that sort of theme, the argument for it, has lasted a long time. And then just the last few years, it has really shifted to this kind of conversation that we're nationally around parental freedom, and that it's school choice is a value in itself, that every family, regardless of income or need or special status, should be able to use tax dollars to pay for whatever kind of schooling they want, including homeschooling in some of these states. So it's that shift has really been noticeable. And with that, the last few years, there's been kind of a really overt attack on public education by a lot of Republican lawmakers.
I don't know if our organizers thought of this, but I want to be able at the end of this to let you guys ask some questions. I'm sure people have questions. Is that okay? Because I'm sure I won't get to everybody's questions. Anyway,
At the end or?
yeah, at the end. I just wanted to interject. So, you know, we all know that teachers' unions have been pretty unified in their opposition in many, you know, really every case I can think of to school choice movement, to vouchers and charters. I think a lot of people will be surprised to read that Albert Shanker, the famed leader of the American Federation of Teachers, sort of a union firebrand, was an early advocate for charters. I'm curious, in places where you found that charters have been successful, and there aren't a ton of them, but there are a few scattered. Hear what you heard from the teachers' unions in those places regarding the success of those schools.
I mean, teachers' unions have traditionally been opposed. Albert Shanker was a really interesting anomaly, and his support was brief, right? He said, he proposed something that is not really what we see now. He proposed what sort of charter schools were in the school district, not outside the school district, so different understanding of it. And within a few years, he was calling it a gimmick. So that sort of opposition from teachers' unions has been longstanding. I think one of the cases that the teachers' unions make in response to successful charter schools in some places is that in some ways the charters are finding ways to sort of skim better families, you know, if you want to say better families, but children maybe who don't have as many needs. In some cases, the charters are not able to serve them, or they are finding ways to sort of push families out. That's some of the response to some of the schools that are doing well. But there's research that has shown that some charter schools in some areas are doing well. You know, it varies really widely.
So, through all of that and all that looking around and all that research, where do you come down on the question of school choice and whether it has helped public education or not?
I don't think that there is a really easy answer on that. There's a little bit of research that shows that there's some competitive effects, that competition actually does drive a small amount of improvement, but it depends on how much choice there is, right? So there's a study maybe a year or so ago that showed that in school districts that had about 10% of charter schools, they saw some improvements for the entire system, but part of that was because some of the lowest performing traditional public schools closed. So as a policy, you know, you can go back and forth on whether or not that's a good thing, right? So there's some argument for some of the competitive effects. But ultimately, what I think is kind of interesting is that as a policy, when it started, no one knew how these programs would do. There was an assumption that giving kids a way, I'm talking about private school choice now, but giving kids a way to go to a private school with a voucher, that the private school must be better. There was just this kind of underlying assumption that was the case. And most of the research studies now actually don't show that kids who are using vouchers do better test score wise. They do about the same, and in some cases they actually do worse. And so, you know, I kind of go back and forth on, for some individual kids and families, it probably helps. And for the system, as a policy, there's not a lot of research to back it up.
And about research, anybody, since we're at a sort of a university environment, there might be some researchers here, and you know, anybody who has looked at education at all, from any angle, it becomes pretty quickly inundated with the amount of research that's out there. So I want to ask a couple of questions about research. There's so much, but it's also so easily used as a political tool, research. So I wanted to hear a little bit about how you kind of sifted through what's out there and what seemed legitimate to you, and what were the red flags for things that seemed questionable in research.
Yeah, you would think that this would be easy, and it is not. There's a ton of research, and you kind of have to look at where it's coming from. I mean, with anything you do, but you kind of have to look at where it's coming from, maybe who has paid for it, and then the actual quality of the actual research that they've done. Is it a large sample of kids? Is it a large sample of schools? Are you comparing sort of apples to apples with the children that you're trying to study? There's lots of pitfalls there. There's not really a perfect way to study these programs. And one of the things I did in the book, I didn't want to write a book only about research, because that would be really dull. But I had some advice from someone at one point who said, maybe include the research at the moments where it was critical. And so you could see where early on there's like none. And then for a long time, there was only one Milwaukee school choice program, and there was no good research that said it was working. And then at a certain moment where it was sort of politically useful, suddenly someone came forward with research that showed that this was going to save urban education. And so, you kind of have to look at when is it coming, how long was the study, how many years were you, and so it's not easy actually to do. And I also talked to other journalists who are good at reading studies and see what they think about particular studies and interview some of the researchers themselves. But we definitely see with this topic, because it's so polarizing, people sort of cherry pick the parts of the study that maybe they like. Or sometimes you really do see, like conservative foundations put out studies that seem to align very closely with some of their values, and you have to look closely at that.
Was there research that you wished you could find that didn't exist? A topic area that you really wanted to see examined that wasn't there?
I mean, I think what's missing right now, which is it's just not possible yet to have it, is we've gone from these small programs that are for targeted populations, so maybe it's only low-income kids below a certain level. And now we're seeing this huge push right now to go universal. Every kid in the state qualifies. There's just no research on that. So, I would love it if some of these states that are passing these programs attached evaluation requirements and research requirements. And in many cases, they're not. We may not actually know how it works out, but that would be nice. That would be nice to see. What happens when it gets bigger? Because we know a little bit about when it's small.
It's a pretty high risk experiment to throw in something, so life-changing when there's really no math.
Yeah, you might say that.
So let's pivot a little bit to Washington State, where we have been kind of holdout or stronghold, depending on your point of view. Quite reluctant to jump into charter schools and the entire school choice discussion. Where do you see Washington State in that conversation? And I mean, do you think that things will stay that way here? I think we have 16 charter schools at this point, which is pretty tiny.
It's crazy, actually. It's interesting because I grew up in Washington State. I grew up outside of Spokane. I went to the University of Washington, and my first job in journalism was here. And then I moved to Florida, which has had school choice, since the late 90s, and it has school vouchers and it has tax credit scholarships. It has charter school. It's like a lab for school choice. And it was such a foreign concept to me coming in, having grown up here. And I, grew up in a smaller area where there was no choice because there were like 4 schools. That's just where everybody went. And so it's such a strange thing to see. But I think one of the reasons that it hasn't really taken off here is because Democrats usually oppose almost all forms of school choice. And the people on my eastern side of the state kind of get outvoted by the people on this side of the state. And so, I don't think that we're probably going to see in Washington what we've seen in some of the Republican states. But the charter school thing was interesting to watch because it was so contested, you know, it was in the courts until only a few years ago, and we're still talking about a very small number of charter schools. But if you look at the history, you can see why people might so fiercely oppose even the smallest amount, because what tends to happen is it starts small and then it grows. And so it makes more, when I started, I kind of thought, well, what's the big deal about a few schools? And now you can kind of see, well, a few schools often turns into many, and then it's this kind of question of, well, where is this headed? I think Washington is one of the states that has a more restrictive charter school law. And so there's a limit, I think it's like 40 for the whole state that's allowed to open. And I mean, I live in.
And that legislation has now passed its time limit, so there are.
Yeah, there was a 5 years, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I saw something about someone trying to repeal it even. I don't know if that went anywhere. I don't think it actually did go anywhere. There was a proposal I saw about repealing it, but yeah, I live in New York and there's a cap on how many you can have, but there's still just tons of charter schools.
Have you been able to see any difference when a charter school is part of a network? Sort of like, you know, do you see any results when a charter school is an individual school versus when it's part of an entire sort of business?
Yeah, it's interesting. Networks seem to have done better. I don't know necessarily why that is, and some networks are better than others, but they do seem to have done better than that sort of mom and pop charters. I think some of that is probably resources and replication of things that work. You know, so you've seen kind of over time this rise in charter networks where there's a very popular one and then they try to replicate it all over. And there's been some complications with replicating, you know, of how many you can have before some of the sort of things that worked maybe don't work as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it does seem like the networks have been more successful.
So much of what you write about in the book indicates that sort of what we're seeing now in the school choice conversation is kind of a reinvigoration of older discussions, right? Like segregation, even the sort of parent choice part sort of echoes from earlier days. And I'm wondering if there are things that you see now that are really new trends.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when I was looking at this, you know, you're digging around in the archives and doing all this research in the 50s and the 60s and a little bit in the 19th century. And some of it, it's like, oh my God, this is just the same stuff over and over. And I think as education reporters, we've seen that list. You cover it a while and it's like, this is the same. We're always having the same conversations about class sizes and segregation and, you know, testing. But the thing that I think is interesting right now is it's had so much momentum in the pandemic that really kind of opened up political opportunity. And the Supreme Court having a conservative majority has really like lined up some key legal victories for the movement that has made it more and more possible to direct state aid to private schools. And now we're to the point where, because of the last couple of Supreme Court cases, we're talking about religious charter schools. And that is a startling development just in the last year. It's not actually in the book because it is so new. And you know, I think that's the next few years of litigation are gonna be over religious charter schools.
I'm really glad that you brought up the pandemic, even though we're all glad to maybe be almost through it, because I think that it's really a driver here for this conversation. So I'm interested in hearing what you see, because now we have students with ever higher needs as a result of the pandemic coming back into traditional public schools, and we also have declining enrollment at the same time. We have both things happening, and I'm just be really curious to hear your thoughts about how the pandemic will figure into this conversation about school choice.
I mean, I think the pandemic did a couple of things. You know, districts across the country handled the initial months of COVID very differently. You know, a lot of places initially closed, but then some communities stayed. They had their public schools closed a lot longer, but private schools maybe were open. Charter schools actually, for the most part, were similar to traditional public schools in their closing policies. But what you basically saw was all of these parents trying to figure out what the heck to do without public school and without childcare, and I was one of them. I have 3 kids, and I had a baby at the time. It was just like a nightmare. And so I think what you saw was a lot of parents trying other things. You know, we had a move. Charter schools gained something like 240,000 kids in their enrollment nationwide. The traditional public schools lost enrollment. Private school enrollment went up. Homeschooling went way up. Black homeschooling went up quite a bit, and some states more than others. And so you had people who maybe had been enrolled in public school doing other things. And then as a parent, when things start opening back up, you have to decide, do you want to have the kids go through a whole nother transition? Do you want to have them go back? You know, maybe what you were doing was working for you in a way that you hadn't thought about before. And so it opened this kind of opportunity where you had a disruption to public education, parents looking at other options, and then really politicians capitalizing on it to some extent. And we're still seeing the outcomes of that.
And back to Washington, do you anticipate we'll just sort of stay where we are with our 16 charter schools because we have this restrictive credentialing process? Or do you anticipate sort of an opening of the floodgates? We've had definitely a significant drop in enrollment in traditional public schools since the pandemic.
Yeah, I was looking at this earlier today, because I had coffee with a friend and she was talking about what she had done with her kids. And it seems like public school enrollment has dropped, but private school enrollment has gone up a bit. And it's been kind of interesting to look to see, does it last? Because the Catholic schools had a good bump for a year, and then it kind of flatlined a bit, and they've been declining forever. So, you know, it's hard to know, because I think if there's increasing private school enrollment, maybe there's some parental will to push for choice options. But in a state like Washington, where they're so fiercely opposed and you have Democratic leaders, I don't know that it will.
What about you guys? Do you have questions? I feel like we should open it up a little bit.
Excuse me, I wonder, could you address the funding of schools in this state based on property values and what effect that will have when all of these kids that have been disabled by the COVID need extra help?
Well, you know, it's not just property taxes. I mean, you have this problem with school funding where it's based on enrollment, right? So if kids leave for other options, then you have less money. But what we have right now are kids with a lot of needs, and the federal money that went into schools, all of these COVID relief packages, those are sunsetting. I think it all has to be spent by October of next year. And so, you know, you have kind of a potential perfect storm here, but we still have kids with a lot of needs, you know, and social needs and behavior needs, and then the academic needs, and potentially less resources for them. And I work for Chalkbeat, which covers education nationally, and we just had a story with AP about school districts who invested some of those dollars in like more social workers or more reading specialists or whatever it was. And now they're letting go of some of those positions, but the kids' needs haven't gone away. And so, you know, I worry about this generation of kids who have been impacted by this.
What I was really getting to, could you compare Oregon, which has an income tax, with Washington, which forbids it, as far as support of a basic thing like education?
I mean, every state does it a little differently. Property taxes have limitations, right? Because what you end up seeing are and not in every state, but in some states, wealthy communities have better resourced public schools than less wealthy communities, and that happens all over the place. Pennsylvania just had a big lawsuit, it's getting appealed, but basically all of these school districts in Pennsylvania where it's really based on their individual property, if the community is property rich or property poor. And so there's huge disparities. These school districts got together and sued and said, we need to have a better way to do this. And it's being appealed at the moment, but that happens in a lot of states. In Florida though, where I worked for a long time, they do it a little differently, and you have property-rich counties actually give money through the state's funding formula to less property-rich counties. So there's different ways to do it. She has the mic. I'm not in charge of it, I promise.
Whoever has the mic has control. So first I want to applaud you for this research. I think it's really great, and I'm glad that you even have that title as a former school principal and educator and researcher. I think it's really important what you're doing. Here's my biggest concern. I did some research on vouchers and support for private schools in other countries. South Korea, Finland, Japan, and Canada. And whenever a number of them do support giving subsidies and also supporting students in private schools, but they have tremendous accountability.
Yeah.
Staff training, testing, curriculum control. And so my question to you is, are you seeing any states that are giving away some billions of dollars that they have instituted sufficient accountability for the places that are receiving money?
That's a really good question. It varies a lot. A lot of these programs have almost no accountability, and certainly not the accountability that traditional public schools are held to, or even the charter schools are held to. In some cases, some of the longer standing programs like Milwaukee comes to mind, because they had issues where schools opened and accepted public dollars and then closed, where there was fraud, or some of these issues that we've seen. In the places where they've had that, there have been efforts to address the accountability a little bit. Like Milwaukee has increased regulation over time, and Milwaukee now is a place where the kids take the same tests, so you can compare test scores, which is not true in a lot of places. So it varies a lot, which is one of the reasons that I think it's sort of complicated to just say yes or no, because maybe someone is okay with a program that is small and directed at a certain group of students and has all of that regulation and accountability, baked into it. And they're not okay with like a place like Arizona where there's very, very little, and I think that's one of the biggest issues out there. That's maybe less headliney than other things, but really is what matters, is what are people doing with this money when they get it.
Could you comment on the relationship between democracy and what's happening with public education? We've always considered our public schools a pillar of democracy. And again, I was raised in a rural area in Illinois, and the school was the glue that held the community together. So.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one of the things that It's one of the things I think about with this topic, is there's sort of two different visions competing here about education. And the school choice side tends to be sort of consumer driven and sort of individualistic. What is good for my child, and what education services can I buy, right, for my child? And public education has always been this idea of, well, what are we as a community buying for our children? It's our obligation, everyone, to pay for children's education. And so it's a very different view, right, of education, because in the public model, maybe I'm paying taxes and you're paying taxes, we're all paying taxes for something that benefits my kid for a little period of time, like a reading specialist. She's below level, see the reading specialist, and then she's on level and we're done with that, but some other child is benefiting from that. There's that kind of aspect, that community aspect of it. And I think you know, we've always, as a country, sort of seen a link there between all of us going to schools together and what that can bring, you know, and democracy. What does that do for citizens to grow up with all these different people and go to school? You know, you might encounter people in a public school that you don't in your neighborhood or in other walks of life. But it is this sort of tension between kind of this consumer idea of what am I buying versus what are we all providing for everybody. And it's, you know, it's interesting, not to get totally off topic here, but when you say rural Illinois, there are some states right now that you would think, like Texas and Oklahoma, where you would think that this would be a sure thing, you know, because Republican-led states. And actually rural Republican lawmakers have voted against some of these programs because in these very small communities, the schools are the heart of the community, and maybe they're a major employer and people know each other, and probably they feel like their values are reflected in the schools. So the long-winded answer, but.
Well, I'll invite you to be long-winded on this.
You don't want to do that.
Well, I'll give you the opportunity because you mentioned the Supreme Court. And
Yeah.
I don't know how much you covered that in your book, but obviously, choice for women has become a major issue, and I expect it'll be a major issue in the 2024 elections. And recognizing the famous, the Boston, fictional Boston bartender who said the Supreme Court, they read the election returns, and John Roberts, who, despite his Reaganite background, is concerned about the credibility of the court. This will be speculation, recognizing that we don't have psychohistory even on this planet. But do you want to speculate about how likely some of the more extreme opinions of the court are to be, how likely they are to be reversed, either under the current court or under a revised court that's more democratic?
That's not where I thought you were going with that.
Oh.
But that's interesting though.
Well, feel free to go wherever you want.
Well, so I'm trying not to make predictions or speculate because I didn't think like DVDs would catch on. So I'm not a good person for that. But you know, I thought the legal history was incredibly interesting and important, and probably wrote too much about it actually in the book, and tried to figure out a way to make that interesting. So we'll see what people think. But I felt like none of this went anywhere or would go anywhere if they didn't win at the courts. And so I thought that was incredibly important to understand, and also to understand how they won in the courts. And so I ended up writing quite a bit about it. I don't know that some of these cases will get overturned. I don't know what, it would have to be a pretty dramatic thing to happen in the court to have that occur. But the other thing is that, you know, a couple of these court cases that have happened in the last few years that have really kind of opened the door for some of this, Carson versus Macon is one, and Espinoza versus Montana is another one, where the court basically said, if you're going to have a program where you give money to a secular private school, then you have to give it to a religious private school or it's discrimination, you know, religious discrimination. Those cases didn't come out of nowhere. They're not just a product of the Roberts court. You know, William Rehnquist he was like from early on was dissenting in some very early cases and was pointing a direction for these things. And so, you know, it's been 20 some years of cases kind of chipping away at this church-state line and making it more and more possible for this money to go to private schools. And that's not an easy thing if suddenly the court changed. It's not an easy thing to just go back on, you know? So I don't know that that's gonna change, which is part of why I went with the aggressive subtitle.
Hi, I was wondering if you were familiar with the research in education by the economist Brian Kaplan. You can pass on.
Say the name again.
Brian Kaplan.
I don't think so, but tell me what it is.
So one of his core theses is that schools have very little transformative power. When someone is very successful in school, they get grades, they come to college. This is more indicative of underlying traits that existed after school. Things like having good
Interesting.
intelligence, personality traits. That would definitely provide context to why it doesn't seem like the debate between charter schools and private schools is very much affecting on research.
Yeah, there's been kind of a debate and research for a long time about how much does a school actually affect a child? Like, do we ask schools to do too much? Do we expect them to do too much? Because maybe a lot of this is your family and your income. And test scores tend to show that a lot of it is income, like because you just have more resources, you're exposed to more things. I think though, one of the things that education research tries to do is to pinpoint how much the school matters and how much the teacher matters. There's a lot of research around trying to sort that out. And I think it's fairly safe to say that schools and teachers do matter, but they're not like miracle workers, right? If you some of the things that are effective have to do with segregation and income and in New York City, there's a few schools, but there's a school I'm thinking of where almost every kid is homeless. That is a huge challenge to ask a school, to overcome, and what I think of as a reporter is, the story there is, why did you zone a school where all the kids have such high needs? Is that a best practice? Why would we ever do that? So anyways, it's a roundabout way of answering, but that kind of question has been in education research for a long time.
Could you talk about a couple key takeaways from your book for those of us who would like to see public schools thrive?
Oh, I don't know how hopeful my book is. The journalists aren't really hopeful people. But that said, I think one of the things that I sort of think about with this, is that public education is not a perfect system by any means, and some of the inequities that we see in public schools kind of make some of the arguments for school choice, because you do have that tension between what is right for my child and what is right for the community. And I think that if you're interested in public education thriving, if you're a parent, then you should try to use public schools, right? Because sometimes what we see are a lot of people who are affluent and have maybe time to volunteer and some of these things, who make other choices and they send their kids out of the system. And I think voting matters a lot right now in about parents, but it's perfectly involved in public schools and not be a parent too. There's all kinds of teachers who need volunteers, and so I would say that.
As someone who grew up in the presence of White Academy, the private schools that were intended for only white students, and comparing that to a legitimate private school like the Lakeside School or Holy Names we have here in Seattle, are you seeing, with that in memory, are you seeing the current wave of the private schools and the charter schools, any of them becoming highly partisan?
In other words, deliberately hiring and deliberately wanting to attract people with a certain political bent. Because I would think that some parents would be more comfortable if their teachers had the same political views they did.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think what we're seeing in a lot of states, Republican-led states right now, are efforts from the top down to try to control what teachers are teaching and what books are available. You know, there's a lot of sort of top-down efforts. Florida is definitely one where that's happening. There's also a push for, they're sort of called these classical charter schools. And those, you know, those tend to be values oriented, like very similar to what you might find in a religious school, but they're not actually supposed to be religious. So there's definitely things like that are happening right now. Hillsdale is one where they, you know, they're creating a charter model that Tennessee was just fighting over a little bit ago, but where they're using a particular type of curriculum, and then of course that attracts families who are interested in that model. So I do think that's happening to some extent.
So I was raised in a very rural community, so there would be no charter school that would be interested in our community. So in some ways, I think that can be, for me, I want to see public schools thrive, and I'm not fond of charter schools and the choice effort. But I also feel like in the cities where I'm living, there of local politics that decide impacts of, and I feel like a local school in a neighborhood has a very positive impact on the neighborhood. It's a very important piece of the neighborhood, but local politics often drive the more influential groups or people who, like if you're in a revitalizing neighborhood, then you're still trying to work together to save your school, and you're not as aware of like all the connections and how to make those connections. And the more solid, older neighborhoods tend to sort of win those fights and cause inequality. And then there's a constant disruption of school assignments, which also disrupt the community connections. And whether you have kids in school or not, that is a very big disruption to your community. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on local school boards and politics. And their impact.
I think we just ran out of time. Oh God, I mean, I've been to so many school board meetings over the years, and it's like one of those things where either nobody comes out and it's you and the board, or like everybody comes out, because they're rezoning a school, and no one is ever madder, I think, aside from maybe this current political moment, than when someone's rezoning the school. It's like, but what's interesting right now that seems to be happening, and I might be going in a different direction, but what's interesting right now is there's school board meetings have often been very dull places for those of us who spend a lot of time at them. But in recent years, there's been kind of this effort by some conservative groups who realize there's a lot of power in those local positions that maybe people aren't paying as much attention to. And there've been some really crazy school board elections in some different places where, people are getting elected and in groups and really steering things in a different direction. And that's happened, I think, more in red states. Wisconsin has had some interesting cases, and Florida certainly has, North Carolina has. But it's like those boards actually do a lot. They actually make pretty big decisions about what neighborhood schools look like and what curriculum, maybe we're gonna use. And And so,
I'm just gonna say the disruption, the constant disruption though chases people away from the public schools. They'll think, well, at least I'll send my kids to this other private school for a little while the school district settles down.
yeah, and the school districts never really settle down, right? You know, it's like, I mean, I'm thinking of, my family being in New York City and watching the changes with when Mayor Adams was elected and now watching a whole new group come through the DOE and now reading curriculums are changing and schools are consolidating and closing. And some of those things I think do drive families away, But that's also kind of the democratic process, so I don't know if there's a good solution to it,
All right, we've got time for one more question.
Moms for Freedom.
Interested in your comment on the following statistics. 20 years ago, we had 550,000 people in Seattle. Today we have approximately 750, I'm rounding. 20 years ago, we had 110,000 kids in the school system. Today we have 40,000. Your comments?
40 in Seattle Public Schools, it's actually about 48,000, 49, just
but it's gone down.
around here. Yes, it's gone down.
I mean, it's gone down all over the place, I mean, I keep referencing New York because I live there, but New York has lost like 12%, I mean, a massive amount just in the last few years. Some of that though isn't necessarily a reflection of the quality of the school. Some of it is families getting priced out of the cities, and some of it is also declining birth rate. It's expensive to have kids, people are having fewer of them, and if you can't afford to live, I mean, some of that people are assuming is quality, like, oh, the schools are terrible, so families are fleeing. Some of it is they can't afford to live in the cities anymore, so, and I don't know what Seattle is like now, but it wasn't super affordable when I was in college here, and I don't think it's gotten better.
It's not gotten better.
So I had a friend telling me today that, there's some neighborhoods now where they're talking about closing schools, or they have closed a few schools because there's not enough families to support the enrollment. So, I mean, it's a complicated issue. That's not just the school system, I think is what my answer is. Yeah. And you said last question, so.
About that time.
Okay.
There's one more.
The Moms for Freedom has a chapter here in Western Washington.
You mean Moms for Liberty,
Liberty,
right?
right.
Yeah.
And they are right-wing school board people. But I just wanted to say that the Seattle Times has been a big pusher of Blethen, the charter schools. What do you think about that?
Me.
Say, I don't actually know.
All right. So we haven't written anything about on the editorial board about Moms for Liberty. It is true that the publisher has been a strong supporter of charter schools. What is your question?
Well, we don't get our own police department, so why should we get our own schools?
We're talking about community.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Well, we got tax-supported schools.
Yes.
Tax-supported police department, but we don't get our own police department. So why should we get tax money going to our preference of schools? I mean, where does all that come from?
Well, I mean, the charter schools are also tax supported. They have autonomy, from
Ours are different though.
the school district. Yeah, what did you say?
Well, our charter schools are actually funded through the Opportunity Pathways program, which is
Yeah.
lottery funding.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. So, but doesn't the money follow the child when they leave the
It
district?
does, it's
Yeah.
the same amount of money, but the money does not come from the general fund.
Can you repeat that?
Give her a mic.
The funding for charter schools or students in charter schools comes from what's called the Opportunities Pathways account, which is lottery money. And it does not come from the general fund, although the charter school advocates have been lobbying for money from the general fund and for levy money, which they don't get, thank God.
But we need to remember that at state level, all revenues are fungible. If money comes from pot A, then it doesn't have to come from pot B. And just because it's coming from the lottery money, doesn't mean it's any different than property tax money. If it didn't come from the lottery, it would come from the property tax. It's money, revenues are totally fungible.
Well, that's true, but I was thinking that sometimes these programs people are more comfortable with them if the funding is not coming from the school district, and in some cases, they'll have separate funding for it, but I mean, your point
It's
is.
called the Common Schools Fund.
Yes.
Now I feel like we're just having like coffee
I
or dinner or
think
something.
we can go ahead and have our conversations after the event. Let's get Kara in.